long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by the professor of law at Chase Law School, Ken. Ken, welcome to The Politics Guys.
Hey, Trey, it's great to be back.
Yeah, it's fun that we kind of get to come back a little bit sooner, and a lot of things happening this week. One of the things, both of us have been looking at, of course, is we've had the slowest rollout of Supreme Court cases in modern history so far. And we've had a few big ones, but obviously a lot of the ones we had our eyes on haven't quite yet come out. So we're going to be taking a look at a number of the major cases. But what we're going to be starting with is probably a really big policy issue. And that was this week's President Biden's announcement of a new pathway to citizenship for undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens. Now, what this policy does is allow individuals to apply for lawful permanent residence, that's a green card, without needing to leave the country, provided they have lived in the United States for at least 10 years and meet some other eligibility criteria, including passing a criminal background check. The initiative is estimated to impact about 500,000 undocumented spouses and somewhere in the vicinity of 50,000 children under the age of 21 who have a U.S. citizen as a parent. I think in a big way, Ken, that a lot of what we're seeing here is this is an attempt to solidify support on the left, who were pretty frustrated by, I think, a more stringent position that the Biden administration had taken earlier in the year on immigration, I think in large part to try to, I don't want to be not as hardline as Trump, but to shore up his electoral strategy on this side. And I think that is the kind of part of the goal here. And it's definitely the reason for the timing. There's already been kind of a strong partisan reaction, as you might imagine. Republicans, chief among them, Texas Governor Greg Abbott, criticizing the policy as, quote, blatantly illegal and nothing more than, quote, pandering for votes, end quote. But meanwhile, Democratic groups, of course, have praised this step as long overdue, and again, as being a corrective, in the words of some, to the earlier issue of what was happening with the Biden administration. So, Ken, what both is your position on this policy, its legality, and obviously, given its timing, its electoral strategy?
I wish I would have a position on its legality. I've been away on vacation all week, and I just got back today, and I really have not had a chance to do the legal analysis to say whether it's legal or not. I think it's really going to depend on the immigration statutes and on what kind of discretion they leave with the executive branch over setting procedure. And I guess he's really couching it primarily in terms of change to procedure more than change to substantive policy. It's just the procedure of whether somebody who's a spouse or stepchild of a citizen would have to leave the country in order to apply for a green card or for citizenship. I think under current procedure, they would have to do that from outside the country, and he's changing it to allow them to do that from inside the country.
Yeah, if they had been previously undocumented, right? So
right, if they've been previously.
And I think that's something that's a little confusing for individuals, and I kind of had to read about that was, right, that wouldn't be the case had you not been undocumented, right? So in other words, had you been here with documentation, you don't necessarily have to leave. But if you've been here undocumented, get married, then the path to citizenship at this moment requires you not to remain in the United States.
Yeah, and right. In fact, they do issue for documented aliens. There's actually a form of visa called a fiance's visa. So,
yes.
So they can actually get a visa to come here to get married to an American. But I think the whole concept of the way most of the tenor of immigration law works by statute is that undocumented aliens, no matter how good of a claim they might have to become documented, they have to leave the country generally to apply so that the country can then decide whether to let them back in or not. And I think for spouses, it's usually should be pro forma because there's a pretty easy path for spouses to get documented. But the issue is just that if they're undocumented now, they would have to still leave the country to apply until the new Biden order takes effect. And whether he has legal authority to make that change or not depends, I think, on a deep dive through some statutes that I have not been able to do yet. And it didn't help that he released this in the form of a press conference and not a formal executive order yet. Although I think an executive order is supposed to be coming very soon, but I wasn't able to find the written executive order if there's one out yet.
No,
so
there is not yet a formal executive order, and that's obviously my area as well. So no, and that does make it a little bit complicated. But on the policy side, I mean, obviously, I'm actually, probably some of the most liberal, if you will, when it comes to immigration policy. But, to play the devil's advocate to this position, I do see the point for individuals who want to have a stronger border to say, well, isn't this just effectively to say, well, look, if you can convince somebody to marry you, you're just making life easier if you're already doing something illegal, i.e. being here undocumentedly? So take it on as a policy stance for a second, because I think that's the direction it's headed, right here.
Yeah, but we already have an immigration law that says if someone who's not a citizen of the United States can convince a U.S. citizen to marry them, then they have a path to citizenship that's pretty fast tracked. And the only thing this is changing is not the substantive standard. Pretty much anybody who marries a U.S. citizen and who doesn't already have a criminal record on the substance is going to have a path to becoming a U.S. citizen. The only thing that he's really changing is whether they have to leave the country in order to apply.
But I think the argument against it, Ken, and this is this is maybe the partisan point, right? That by being here undocumented, you are in fact a criminal because you violated knowingly laws to be here.
Well, those are only civil laws. Those are not criminal laws. It's not a crime to come into the country without documentation. It could be if you come into the country after having already been deported once, then it becomes a crime to reenter. But a person most undocumented people in the country have not committed a crime. It's just a civil offense. The immigration laws are civil laws. They're not criminal laws.
So in that case, so that's what so on a policy side, that would make you more inclined towards it in that case.
I'm totally inclined towards it. I think, anyone who marries a U.S. citizen, there's a very good reason that the immigration law gives a fast track to unify families, right? And in fact, I have one of my brothers-in-law is from the UK, and my wife's sister, who's American, married a British man, and he had a path to citizenship, and that just seems very normal to me. That happens all the time, that Americans marry foreigners, and then the foreigners become citizens. And if they're marrying a U.S. citizen, there's a lot less risk involved in letting them into the country. They're going to have someone who has connections in America. Presumably they're going to be married to someone who's at least employable, and in most cases they probably would be employable if they're finding someone here who wants to marry them. It just seems like a very low risk proposition in terms of accepting immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think we have a ton of a disagreement here, and so that might be part of the problem. But the one little bit that I might add to say, kind of to see on that front, is just to say, well, then why the particular timing? If this is such an obvious and easy one, why does Biden wait till the very end of 4 years here to tackle this issue? It seems like this might have been something you might have done when you first take office as part of that kind of flurry of executive actions that you take. So what about the possibility that this is more or less just a vote pander than it is a real policy?
Well, I think it's both, right? I mean, I think it's both good policy and good politics for Biden to take the position that he's trying to stop the fast flow of new immigrants into the country, and he's also trying to help the immigrants that have been here for a while and haven't caused problems. I think that is good politics and it is good policy, and they run hand in hand. It probably should help him in Nevada, especially. So in that sense, I think you've got a swing state that he's been running a little weak in, and maybe this will help shore things up. But I do think it's the same general policy that he's been articulating since he first ran for office in 2020, that he was in favor of finding pathways to citizenship for people that are already here, while tightening up the border for people who aren't already here.
Okay, so Ken, why don't we move forward then to a trio of Supreme Court cases that we got primarily on Thursday, but then as a little bit of a surprise also today on Friday. And let's start with Moore versus the United States, where we had some pretty sharp, divergent opinions between the majority and the minority over the mandatory repatriation tax imposed in 2017, Tax Cuts and Job Acts, which basically taxes certain foreign earnings of U.S. shareholders. And so Kavanaugh ended up writing for the majority, and he upheld the tax as constitutional. In his opinion, he asserted the tax falls within Congress's authority under the 16th Amendment, which permits taxes on income, quote, from whatever source derived, end quote. Oh, excuse me. The court held that this includes taxing undistributed profits of foreign corporations, even if those earnings are considered unrealized income by the shareholders. Kavanaugh was joined by Justice Roberts, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson. Barrett concurred, joined by Alito, who emphasized the historic context and precedents that support Congress's broad taxing powers. Thomas authored the dissent, joined by Gorsuch, arguing that the tax is unconstitutional because it taxes unrealized income, and specifically in the dissent goes against the 16th Amendment's provision that income must be realized before it can be taxed. Thomas contended that the tax's unrealized gains exceeds Congress's taxing powers and violates the principle of taxing actual income. So, what was your takeaway on this case, Ken?
Well, it was a no-brainer of a case. It should have been 9-0, and the Kavanaugh opinion is obviously right. I was a little bit surprised that the Barrett concurrence, joined by Alito, leaned as far in the direction of Thomas's dissent as it did. And I think that Barrett was trying to create a little bit of space for later saying that a wealth tax is still unconstitutional. Although I think at least the 5 who joined the Kavanaugh opinion have made it clear that a wealth tax is constitutional, which it is. And to explain that, let me back up a little bit, because a lot of these constitutional principles of taxation, may not be that familiar to all our listeners, but
I'm going to plug something just for a second. But of course, we've talked about some of this for those who are supporters on our Constitution midweek supporters show.
We talked about all the forms of taxation that are in Article 1, Section 8. We have not yet got to the 16th Amendment, but we will get to that as well. Yeah,
we're coming up on that, so that you still have a chance to both listen to the other ones and obviously get here for that. So, but continue, Ken. Put us in context for those of us who haven't been a part of that.
Quick refresher here. So, when we had our first attempt at a federal government under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government that we had then did not have any taxing powers, and it had to rely entirely on the willingness of states to pay dues in order to operate a continental Congress under the Articles of Confederation, and that was one of the perceived defects with the Articles of Confederation that led our founding fathers to go back to the drawing board and give us our Constitution. They felt that one of the most clear faults with our earlier attempt at a constitution was that the federal government was fiscally insecure, and that it really needed to be able to raise taxation revenues directly from the people rather than just relying on states. So in Article 1, Section 8, the Constitution gives Congress 4 types of taxing powers, but it puts limitations on how some of those powers can be used. So Congress has the power to levy taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. So that's 4 things that are named. And then, and although the word taxes just says taxes, they used to commonly refer to that as what they would call direct taxes. So we could say direct taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And the duties and imposts, just like today, pay would mean things like import tariffs. But the excises would mean taxes on transactions, such as sales taxes. And the direct taxes were, in fact, property taxes or capitation taxes. So a capitation tax is just a tax per head. So like everybody pay $100 tax would be a capitation tax. And they had all that. They didn't initially tax income, and we'll never really know whether the framers thought that an income tax was or wasn't constitutional. But Congress did start levying income taxes around the time of the Civil War, and kept doing that on and off through the 19th century until there was a case called the Pollock case in the late 19th century. And the Pollock case held that income taxes were direct taxes, so they're a permissible form of taxation, but that direct taxes had to be apportioned across the states, and that's one of the limitations on direct taxes. And apportionment sounds like a technical issue, but it's actually a serious impediment because what apportionment means is that each state should have to pay in proportion to its population. And, so if two states have the same population, then the amount of direct taxes collected in each of those two states should be the same as each other. If one state has twice as much population as another state, then the amount of taxes collected should be twice as much in proportion to the population. But that's very problematic for income taxes because we have big income disparities. So if you were going to just charge an income tax and make it uniform nationally, it would fail to be apportioned because some states just have people with much higher incomes than other states. And that was the problem in the Pollock case. So the court did strike down an unapportioned income tax, although it said that it would be permissible to use an apportioned income tax. Well, rather than trying to figure out how to do an apportioned income tax, the Congress responded to the Pollock decision by sending the 16th Amendment out to the states for ratification. And so we end up getting the 16th Amendment in the Constitution. It adds to all the other taxing powers that Congress has the power to tax income from whatever source derived, without regard to any apportionment or enumeration or any census. So Congress gets this plenary power to tax income taxes on top of the power that it already had to levy property taxes and capitation taxes and excise taxes and that kind of thing. So there's actually no argument at all really left that any kind of tax isn't constitutional. The very, very bogus argument that was in the Thomas dissent, tries to argue that unrealized income can't be taxed. But it seems like that's doubly wrong, right? The 16th Amendment says income can be taxed from whatever source it's derived from. So I would think that would mean unrealized gains or realized gains. They're all income. Or that even if not, the old Article 1, Section 8 does allow property taxes. And properties is taxed, whether or not it's sold.
Right, like your house, for example.
Like your house.
Although that's not generally a federal tax, but yeah.
Yeah, and your tax goes up. Right. That's not generally a federal tax, but Congress does have the power to do that kind of tax.
Yes. Yeah. I was just pointing that out just in case anybody was.
Yeah, right. And it does have this problem that it would have to be apportioned across the states, and so the rates might have to be a little bit different from state to state. You couldn't necessarily have a uniform national property tax, but you could certainly have a non-uniform national property tax as long as the rates were jiggered from state to state to make sure that the apportionment requirement was satisfied. And so I think it's so beside the point for the dissenters to argue about whether unrealized income is income or not, because if it is income, it can be taxed as an income tax. But even if it's not income, it can be taxed as a property tax. Yeah. And in fact, many of us have had our property taxes go up when our property value went up, even though we didn't realize any gain from the sale of our property at all. And that's just a normal function of property taxation. So I think it's a no-brainer. Seven justices thought it was a no-brainer in this case, which was about repatriating foreign income. So the story here was...
Well, I was going to say that's one of the things we might want to... We had kind of just maybe glossed a little bit was what happens, right?
What happened?
Yeah, I mean, in this case, what's happening is you have a provision of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts, or sometimes called the TCJA, And that is actually a 2017 President Donald Trump act, which imposed a one-time tax on certain investors, foreign corporations. And so this one-time tax, the policy purpose was intended to offset potential lost revenue that did result from a broader package of corporate tax cuts in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so that's where this comes from. And so in Moore, the plaintiffs owned stock in a foreign company that provided supplies to farmers in India, and the company had earned a significant income since those plaintiffs had invested in it. And the Tax Cuts and Job Acts required them to pay just a little under $15,000 in income taxes on that company's income. And so that's where we get to this question of whether it's permissible to tax a company's owners on income that is earned by the company but has not then yet been distributed to those owners. In this case, what we think of as being the stockholder particular case.
Actually, it had been distributed. They just hadn't repatriated it. They had the money. They just left the money overseas.
Well, again, maybe I'm reading this wrong, but I mean, this was both in the case and also in Vox's reading of it was that the distribution had not yet come out to those individuals. So they owned those shares, but they had not yet made any profit on it, the same way that you were talking about for the house.
No, they owned the shares and they owned foreign financial accounts, and so the money was distributed. The dividends were distributed by the company. They received the dividend distributions into their foreign accounts, and they just used them, to automatically repurchase more shares of the company. So that's the kind of thing that definitely would be a taxable event to anyone who owns shares in an American company.
No, but now pause, because that is something. So if for example, if you have money that continues to go into, say, a mutual fund, you don't earn income tax on that until you actually have the sale of that item. And so, like Vox notes in their argument here, the individuals who owned this portion of the company, because they hadn't realized, i.e., the gains, it was not distributed. So more is specifically about the income, the non-distributed income.
I think it's just the non-repatriated income. They chose to leave the money in another country and to reinvest it in more shares of the same company, but they could have chosen to.
What I'm
take
saying
that
is
money back.
That would not. In other words, had you done that in the United States, in other words, had I owned a piece of Apple, and that piece of Apple accumulates in its size, I would not have technically had any distribute of that income, and therefore would not owe any tax on that, right?
Well, if they paid out a dividend and you told them just reinvest the dividend in more shares, that is a taxable event in the United States in the year that the dividend gets paid out. It doesn't matter if you take it in the form of cash or you take it in the form of more shares.
I would have to look at this a little bit more. I don't disagree, but that is different than the way that, say, Vox and others were describing this situation. But
the tax code here made it relevant whether they had the choice about whether to accept the income or whether to reinvest it. And in the U.S., two things could happen if you just owned a share of U.S. stock. It could go up in value, and then you wouldn't normally be taxed on that till you sold it. But it could also kick out dividends, and you could tell them just automatically reinvest the dividend money in buying me more shares. I don't want the cash. And if you do that, then you have to pay tax on that in the year that the dividend gets paid out, even if you don't take it in cash. And I think this was more like that, but it's not a super important distinction from the constitutional standpoint, because my point is
either one would still be
either one. Yeah, they made money, and they were being taxed on the money that they made.
Yeah, we'll get too into the weeds probably.
What's that?
I said I was getting too into the weeds there, Ken, and my apology.
Yeah. And so of course they can be taxed on that. And now people do think there's a big implication into the concept of wealth taxes, because as you pointed out correctly, it has not been common for the federal government to levy property taxes, even though under Article 1, Section 8, the federal government does have the power to levy property taxes. And part of the reason that it hasn't been common is because there's that apportionment requirement. And so they would have to be non-uniform across states. But a wealth tax is just another word for a property tax, but real property is just one form of wealth, and, other kinds of property or other forms of wealth. And if a state wanted to levy a property tax, not only on real property, but also on things like mutual funds, they could do it. And if Congress wanted to levy a property tax on various forms of property, they could do it too under their power of direct taxation. So there's really no serious constitutional impediment to any kind of wealth tax. But the Moore case was, I think, a stalking horse for that discussion. But the court did come up pretty big on the side of the IRS.
No, I absolutely agree with you. The part where I think we would disagree is not on its constitutionality, but on its policy implication of whether it's good policy or not. And I think that sometimes is what can be difficult here is, I agree. I think we see the Constitution here identically. But we would probably disagree if we were having a policy argument about how should we have those taxes, right? So, for example, at a state level, I do have a problem with the way that we do property taxes because of those kinds of unrealized gains. But that doesn't mean that it's unconstitutional. It just might mean that we think it's a bad idea for other reasons. But and I think that's sometimes difficult when you take a look at Supreme Court cases. We oftentimes want our particular policy positions to win, when really that's the place to be fought out in the legislature.
Yeah, well, I think, right, on policy, I'll just say I don't have any problem with wealth taxes or property taxes. And I know that one of the reasons that, that people maybe like income taxes more somewhat relates to ability to pay, right? That as long as you're taxing income, substantially everybody has, enough income to pay their income taxes. Whereas with property, people can keep living in a house for a long time. And if the house goes up a lot and the corresponding valuation goes up, the tax goes up, you could have people who lose their ability to pay. And
that's a really real thing that happens. It's one of the things that we've talked about in other parts of the show. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I still think it's not unjust, because after all, if look at all these people in Silicon Valley who bought a house, maybe 40, 50 years ago for $100,000 or $200,000, and now their house is worth $3 or $4 million. On the one hand, you could say, well, how are they supposed to pay all that income tax? But on the other hand, you could say, well, they could sell their house and they'd have $3 or $4 million.
You got to live somewhere, though. But anyway, I think we should probably pause on that, since I think, again, on the constitutional side, because we've got two more court cases that we want to get to. And one of those is Gonzalez v. Trevino, where the United States Supreme Court addressed the issue of retaliatory arrest in the context of First Amendment protections. And this is a really big deal because there's this really important case. I believe I'm pronouncing this correctly, Ken, so correct me as the con law professor. Knives versus Bartlett.
Yeah, I mean, I only found out about it when I was reading today's decision. So
so I knew it. Okay,
yeah, but I think that's right. Yeah.
So the deal is that there has to, if you have probable cause to arrest somebody, even if you think that there are reasons that the state or police are being retaliatory against you, it's pretty difficult to bring a suit against the state or the police officers. However, in this particular case, for Sylvia Gonzalez, the court actually ruled in her favor. The court emphasized that there was cause for Knives to actually have a lawsuit that proceeds, because there does need to be a balance against the potential for abuse. And so in this particular case, Gonzalez had presented sufficient evidence that she was arrested not because of the nature of her crime, but because of the nature of her critical speech against the city manager. She had taken a singular paper out with a variety of other papers while she was a city official. No one had ever been arrested for a similar offense or anything like that, but in her particular case was arrested, and as a result, then sued the police and the city manager for that. And the Supreme Court argued that suit could, in fact, move forward. The minority argued that the Fifth Circuit had correctly applied the Knives standard, which requires to show that there was no way for anybody else to be arrested for similar conduct, not just that they had not been arrested for similar conduct, which I thought that was kind of interesting. So that they needed those more stringent requirement because they thought it'd be too easy to get sued and undermine law enforcement. I'll be honest, I was with the majority opinion in this case, Ken. I think we have far, far too many protections for police when they're making cases to not be sued for the things that they do, although I recognize that is not necessarily always a popular position.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of this case exactly. I think I'm on your side on this, but I guess I'm not sure how major of a case it is because I think it's still going to be very difficult for people who get arrested pursuant to probable cause to make the argument that it was a retaliatory arrest.
It's not going to be easy. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah.
But it at least suggests that if no one has ever been arrested for this and suddenly you're the target, that you might have a potential recourse. And again, I think that is a better standard than, well, could anybody make an argument that you ought to maybe sort of kind of be arrested?
Yeah, well,
which seemed to be the state's argument.
I think I agree with you in all the big strokes. I agree that there's way too much immunity for police lawlessness, and in fact, lawlessness of other kinds of government officials, not just police. I don't like all the qualified immunity doctrines that we have. I think it should be easier for people who are victimized by government officials, including police officers, to bring lawsuits. But I kind of think this is a really maybe narrow ruling because it's I think it's a technical ruling. It's taking away one kind of paper barrier, but it's still leaving in place, I think, a very, very thin, small path towards how this particular kind of suit is ever going to be successful. When I was thinking about the politics of it, I was actually a little astonished that Thomas was the lone dissenter because it actually seems to me like this is the kind of thing that Donald Trump always complains about, right? That Donald Trump is saying, in the New York case where he's now been found guilty on 34 counts, I think his main argument has kind of been, well, even though I am guilty of all this stuff, it's still a political prosecution because they don't normally prosecute people for this kind of stuff. And they especially don't normally prosecute people who have closely held businesses like mine, from putting false records into documents that aren't even public documents because I don't even have any shareholders and I didn't even try to use these documents to get loans or anything like that. And, I think, to some extent, Trump's arguments along that line are slightly justified. I still think he was completely guilty, and I think it's interesting here that the majority opinion arguably is saying someone like Trump might be able to bring a lawsuit and say this is a political prosecution, even though he was guilty of the crime. And Thomas in his dissent is the one saying, well, if he's guilty of the crime, then he's got nothing to sue about. And I think if you apply this to Trump, that kind of reverses the polarity of how I would have expected these justices to vote.
I read a lot about this. I had not put it into that context, Ken. That is a read. I haven't even given that any thought. That's a good one.
Yeah, that I think the majority is saying sometimes even when the police.
Do you think this is a hint at what may be getting in the future?
No, because I think if you just write the word Donald Trump in the name, then every justice in the whole case votes the opposite of how they voted here. I think the principles are the same, but it just shows, really what an unprincipled court we have. But I think that I think that this is that is the question in this case is what happens if somebody, committed some violation of law that isn't normally enforced against. And then they want to sue and say, well, even though I did violate the law, they're only enforcing against me because of politics. And the majority saying, well, that's a valid form of suit. And Thomas is saying, if you're guilty of the crime, you're guilty of the crime. Yeah, I think if Thomas would have realized that he's talking about Donald Trump, he would have voted the other way. And that if some of the other justices, including, who voted the other way, realized that they could be talking about Donald Trump, they might have voted the other way from how they voted too.
So okay. So I guess we'll have to kind of wait and see how that plays out.
Yep.
So let's take on the case of the United States versus Rahimi, and this was one that many analysts thought were going to go different ways. I was not quite as surprised by it, but I'm curious about your take as well. But in this particular case, Rahimi, he's not exactly a phenomenal guy. As I like to tell students, right? Cases don't make it to the Supreme Court when you bake grandma's cookies. He is a drug dealer who then actually assaults his girlfriend, with whom he has a baby, and shoots at a bystander in the process. He gets a domestic violence restraining order against him, and he then goes on to have a couple of shootouts. And so they come to his house, and they discover that he has a number of different weapons, including a 45, a 38, and a long 308 long rifle. And he is, as a result, found guilty of owning weapons when he actually has a restraining order. And the key issue here is it constitutional under the Second Amendment to be able to bar someone from the purchase of firearms? I'm going to put this in quotes just because, quote unquote, they have a restraining order against them. And how does this apply to that historic tradition from the standard in the United States, from New York State versus Bruin? And how does it do it? And so Roberts takes on the majority opinion, and he argues that it is, in fact, consistent with historical firearm regulations aimed at preventing violence. And he argues further that historical laws have long permitted disarming individuals who pose a clear threat of violence, and thus supporting measures designed to protect, in this instance, victims of domestic violence. And that seemed pretty straightforward to me, Ken. Now, once again, we're going to have our dissenter on this front, Thomas, arguing that the government failed to provide sufficiently compatible historic laws to justify the modern statute. He didn't think that it met the Bruin test, and that there should be a stricter historical comparison, although he didn't really, for me, make the case why that would need to be. Several of the concurring justices came from more liberals, including Sotomayor and Kagan, who agree with the bottom line outcome, but continue to reiterate their opposition to Bruin. And so, I mean, I thought this was a pretty straightforward case. I think under Bruin, whether you agree with it or not, that this seemed pretty straightforward, that it could be upheld, and it was. And again, you kind of just have Thomas in the corner suggesting that, that it needs to be a little bit stringier yet. Your thoughts on this case, Ken?
I think we did talk about this one around the time of the oral argument. I did predict it would go this way, but I think it is it's walking back the Bruin decision, which I'm glad to see. I don't think that the two decisions are actually can be squared with each other, and I think that this is a very helpful corrective against, I think, what most of the lower courts have been taking to be the meaning of Bruin, and I'll elaborate on that. So you had until the 21st century, there was literally no Second Amendment case law, right? So there was not a single gun control regulation from any state, local government, city, United States government ever struck down on Second Amendment grounds ever until the year 2007. That's the first time that ever happens. So the Second Amendment case law is extremely modern, and it's really a product of today's conservative court. And so when the court starts striking down gun control laws, first in the case of Heller versus the District of Columbia, and then in this case a couple years later of McDonald versus the City of Chicago, the court steps in, into very shallow water, really, and tries to be fairly minimal in what it's holding. But in both of those cases, the court struck down handgun bans that applied against most people, unless someone qualifies for a special exception, first in the District of Columbia and then in Chicago. And the court sort of held that the core meaning of the Second Amendment, which it then said in McDonald also applied against state and local governments through the 14th Amendment, the core meaning was that whatever was kind of the most ordinary weapon of the day, the Second Amendment protected the right to keep that weapon in the home. But then the court also said in both Heller and McDonald, we know that this raises a lot of other special questions, like what about weapons that are less ordinary, or what about carriage of weapons outside the home, or what about restrictions on people who are not law-abiding or who are not mentally fit. And in those early cases, Heller and McDonald, the court sort of said, we're not answering those questions yet. We're not striking down any of those kind of laws yet. We'll eventually deal with those questions one thing at a time. And that was sort of where we were for a little while. In just the last couple of years, we had questions about carriage outside the home. And in the Brune case, the court held that Second Amendment right does include the right to carry outside the home, not just the right to keep weapons in the home. And then now in the Rahimi case, we finally reached the other question that the court reserved, which was, well, what about restrictions on unusually dangerous people? Now, the reason I was starting to say I think these two cases, really are not compatible with each other, is that the methodology that the court used in Brune when it first confronted that question, what about carriage outside the home? There was an actual majority there that said, well, to figure out whether a restriction such as a restriction on carriage outside the home would be constitutional, we have to look at whether it would have been considered constitutional during the founding era. And to figure that out, we have to look at what kinds of restrictions people had in place during the founding era, and whether whether those restrictions were enforced or whether they were considered problematic. And even though, in fact, there were a few jurisdictions in the founding era that did restrict carriage outside the home, the court in Brune said, well, yeah, they did that in a few jurisdictions, but obviously in most jurisdictions they didn't do that, and therefore, the general understanding must have been that everybody can carry outside the home, and if that's what they thought then, that's what we have to think now. So they struck down the concealed carry ban on the theory that most places allowed concealed carry back in 1787. Now, I think if they would have used that methodology here, and this is really what Thomas said in his dissent, domestic violence wasn't even a crime in the founding era. Husbands could beat up their wives with impunity in the founding era, and there was really very little concept in the founding era of taking away guns even from criminals. Most states didn't even do that. So Thomas looks at this and says, well, if we're really going to stick with this strict historical test that we used in the Brune case, basically, since there was almost no gun control in 1787, we can't allow pretty much any gun control now. So we have to let the domestic violence people have their guns, at least unless they're actually convicted of a crime. And then maybe we could talk about taking away their guns then, but not just based on a civil domestic violence restraining order, which didn't even exist in 1787. So Thomas is saying that since there's essentially no restrictions on who can own a gun in 1787, at least for people who are not criminals in jail, that we can't have any such restriction today, and that a domestic violence restraining order today is a civil order. It's not even you don't have to be convicted of a crime to be subject to a domestic violence restraining order. And so if someone wasn't convicted of a crime, then since in 1787 they wouldn't have taken away their guns, today they can't take away their guns. Now, in contrast, the large majority in the case, the 8-justice majority, though they do have a few different written opinions, what they all agree on is that you can't use such a what they call historical twin type approach, where you can't look at history and say, well, if there was no such thing as a domestic violence restraining order in 1787, then therefore a domestic violence restraining order can't be the basis for taking away someone's gun rights. What the majority says is you have to analogize to the concepts that were in play then, and the concept would have been law-abiding person versus non-law-abiding person, and that you had criminals who were incarcerated and their guns were taken away while they were incarcerated, and that was basically that was the legal category that was the non-law-abiding people back then. And now we may have broader categories of what would be a non-law-abiding person, but someone who's under a domestic violence restraining order has been adjudicated to be not law-abiding and to be dangerous, and that's analogous enough to having been convicted of a crime in 1787 that the historic analogy holds up. And so they're really allowing much more analogical reasoning now than what they did in Brune. And I think Thomas, in a way, is right that they've really backed away from Brune, and I'm glad that they have.
I don't think they've backed away entirely from Brune. I mean, as I read Robert's opinion, his comments about, look, in the same way that we didn't understand ordinary weapons at that time to be identical to being the ordinary weapons of this time, and we allow for that to have historic context, so too, he ascertains, we have to do the same thing when it comes to regulations, because as he even puts it, there are none of the amendments where the court has not said that there is not, as he puts it, oh my goodness, I have this here. In other words, they are not, his words are, they're not unlimited, as he says. And so I hear what you're saying. So, I mean, obviously one could have taken that standard further, but with a lot of case law, you see that. We've talked about that as we've gone through in the Constitution cases, how stringently they're going to apply these regulatories. And I see here I don't see this as being inconsistent with Brune. I just see this as being a larger construction, but consistent with Brune. And I don't think that Thomas liked that larger construction for a variety of reasons. He hates larger constructions overall, if we were to take him at face value. And as a result, he is more than willing, I think, to say, well, the weapons themselves could change over time, but not the restrictions. And I think the rest of the court is effectively saying, which I think is consistent with Brune, look, in the same way that we're applying it to the weapons themselves, so do we have to for the analogous laws. Or, and again, in his words, we don't have to be trapped in amber. I loved that, by the way. Just going to throw that out there. And I think that is consistent with the way the court has often ruled, not just on the Second Amendment.
Well, I certainly agree that the majority opinion is sensible and it's principled. I just don't think it matches the same principle that was in Brune. And I think that Thomas wrote the Brune opinion, and he knows what he meant to write. And I think he did mean it to make it impossible to enforce really any gun control regulation. And he thought that he'd kind of pushed the court in that direction. And he was surprised that they weren't all still following him when he got out to the domestic violence.
Now, I will say, though, as we both recognize as individuals who write, say, syllabi and other things, one's intentions and their meanings can sometimes be in non-alignment.
Right.
Okay, but I think we should probably pause on that one there so that we can get at least a couple more stories. And another really big one for me, we've been talking about this. So for those who are part of the Politic Guys supporters, and don't forget, you can become a supporter of the Politics Guys to get access to things like the Discord group. One of the big questions that had come up was what was going to happen with the Supreme Court. And last week, the other guys took on the Supreme Court ruling. But this week, Senate Republicans blocked a bill to ban those bump stocks on weapons. And again, what a bump stock is, it's a device that goes on to a semi-automatic rifle in general to allow it to fire at rapid rates like a fully automatic weapon. It's effectively an add-on to a gun that takes a semi-automatic to an automatic. And so recently, this had been found to be something that could be banned under the ATF, but that got struck down. And kind of across the board, everybody agreed that was probably an overreach, at least last week. We're not going to take that back on. But what happened this week was to say, okay, look, let's make it easy. The Supreme Court has said this is something that we could rule on. Let's rule on it. And Democrats brought forward a bump stock ban, and Republicans said, not so fast. But this was a weird turnaround since in fact, the ban of the law came under the Trump administration. And the primary reasons for Republican opposition, at least overtly, was about overreach and the broader implications of the legislation. Senator Ricketts of Nebraska argued the bill could lead to, in his words, further restrictions on, quote, gun accessories, potentially affecting the right lawful gun owners to use firearms. I'd have to say, Ken, this is one where I think we oftentimes disagree. I think we're going to probably have a lot more agreement. There is absolutely zero reason that this has to lead to anything else. A bump stock is unlike any other modification on a weapon. It doesn't serve any kind of useful hunting, aiming. It doesn't even have a military purpose. I mean, there's a reason you don't do this. The only reason to do this is to kill a bunch of things. There's absolutely no other reason for them. They just are a way to make a weapon fully automatic. And so I was deeply disappointed, I think, by an easy win for Republicans and Democrats to get on a ban for this one. And it just seems such an easy one to get on board with. I was sadly surprised by this outcome, but here we are.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was curious why you think the Republicans blocked it.
You know, I wish I could give you a better answer other than I think, you know, as I had said earlier, we talk about what Biden had done and the timing of executive order. I really think, you know, he was trying to shore up the left in the wake of his policy change on immigration. And I think this is just signaling in the most classic of Mayhewian terms. It has nothing to do with the absolute policy and everything to do with the upcoming election. And I think if Donald Trump had been in office or we weren't later in the election cycle, I think this would have been an easy pass.
Yeah, I mean, it seems it should be, and maybe I guess by your theory, maybe it will in the new year, but we'll see.
Yeah, that would be my absolute hope. And again, this is a person who takes a strong Second Amendment position, but I just there is no utility to a bump stock. I'm sorry. I send me angry emails otherwise. There you go. Okay, so Ken, why don't we're going to finish up here. We had a listener write into us, Ken. Says the last time we were on the show, we had talked about COVID and we had talked about what had been it was secondary to the policy outcome, but we had talked about the potential origins of COVID-19 and some of the potential evolving understandings of that. And again, that was kind of secondary. And so listener Linda reached out to us and said, look, I was really kind of worried to see that you guys had contributed to misinformation. And specifically, one of the articles that we had mentioned on air was the New York Times. And she said, look, that's just basically somebody trying to sell a book. And it's really just settled science that COVID was started by a lab leak. And there aren't any credible virologists who thinks that it does. And so how do we get to the point, basically, where Ken and I could have been so wrong and had that come out? And so why is that, in fact, the way that we took it? And why, in her words, why do we have such a difficulty looking to guidance from professional or scientific organizations? And why doesn't Congress really want to hear from virologists? That's kind of our domain. And so we wanted to at least address that. And to start with, Linda, I think Ken and I both recognize that isn't our area of expertise. So for one of the things, and I'll talk about it from the kind of the way that I approach things. So some of the people on the show might know, I have a variety of health conditions. And so I have read a lot outside of my area of expertise. And I'm always very careful because I recognize that I'm not an expert on things like, immunotherapy and other things like that, although I'm curious and it's important to my life for that, having those understandings. And so it wasn't just the New York Times article that we got at, so for example, one of the things that I had taken a look at personally as we were getting ready for that show was the Journal of Science, which had an overview. And what it says is, look, there's these kind of today two major theories, and they seemingly did not hold them as completely equal, but rather that as being, as they put it, viable theories. And one of them is of accidental release from a lab or zoonotic spillover. Both remain viable. That's the words of the article from Science here just earlier this year. And then even in NIH, which I had also consulted before we had done that show. And so, again, I'm not disagreeing with. So my point of that for you, Linda, is not to say that I necessarily disagree, but I do know from my side as a political scientist who is part of the conversation when it comes to trying to communicate things with the public. And that's one of the reasons we do this show. Is to say, okay, I hear you, but think about, so if others, if Ken and I, who are very educated individuals, can kind of go to what we see as being some of the major journals and see those kinds of comments, you can imagine why we might kind of make the comments that we do on this show. And I think, and so for listeners, I think this is maybe a good evidence for why we do what we do on the show. And that is that scholars do not write for you at all. It is incredible how much they don't write for you. And if you don't believe me, come take one of my classes at OC, where I'm trying to teach undergraduates to start with just how to read things in the social sciences. And just understanding the way that they read and what they do is a huge barrier to them. And these are individuals who've already taken a ton of classes. We're talking about upper level students. These are not just your average run-of-the-mill people. And they're coming in and doing this. And it's a really difficult task to be had. And so, to your question, why don't we trust particular professional or scientific organizations? Obviously, in some instances, we have kind of political things occurring. But I think in this particular instance, like with Ken and I think we're a great example of where I don't think, Ken, neither I have a particularly strong bias about where we think COVID-19 comes from. That's not something that we've argued about on the show, I think, really at all on that front of kind of get into that science. But it does indicate, right, so as we take a look at this, it can be really difficult to try to understand, well, what is the professional opinion on some of these more difficult issues? So again, this isn't, and if we're not just randomly Googling to try to get at this. And so when you're thinking about these kinds of items, I think it's really important to try to get individuals who are semi-experts in their fields, who their primary job, and that's what I really view myself as, Ken, who's, what I have kind of taken on my primary job is not so much anymore trying to produce unique empirical information. I used to do that earlier in my career. And instead, today, what I attempt to do is to try to disseminate that information that I'm reading and understanding in my discipline to particular instances that are interesting, right? Because we just talked about the most recent articles, no one would care. But when we can kind of talk about the cases that are coming up, ways that the policy is affecting your life, and we can bring those conversations and that knowledge to bear, we can do that. And let's be honest, and this is my area right here, that's not always the most exciting thing in the world to do. And not always to be listened to. But obviously, many of you listeners out there have decided that this is worthwhile and that you like doing it. And so I think that's where that really comes from. So, Linda, what I'd say is I don't know if this is really driven entirely by politics so much as it is by the communication divide that there is between detailed experts in subfields and the generalized public who is attempting to grapple with that in ways that can be really difficult to understand at best.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add to that. I would just say, I tried for a very long time to withhold forming any judgment about whether COVID came from a lab leak or from the animal transmission in the wet market, and because I knew there was a professional debate about that, and I didn't feel that there was any benefit at all from people who really had no way of evaluating it themselves to kind of weigh in on that. I think I may have misunderstood based on the New York Times article and the underlying MIT study. I thought there was starting to be a scientific consensus. We heard from listener Linda that that's still not true, and I'm perfectly happy to accept a state of agnosticism about it. Again, I don't know where COVID came from, and I don't pretend that I know where COVID came from.
And so here's what I think we're going to end the show on right here, Ken. That's to say is that I think we need a lot of people, and not just politics people and legal people like you and me, but we need other kinds of experts to be able to be those go-betweens to take that information and make it available. And I would love to continue to see other people do work on that. And again, that's probably not something that is easy to do. And we can do that in part because we are at institutions that support that possibility, but not many institutions do. We're in some really unique circumstances, but I would love to see as a larger part of the world to have biologists and others be able to say, well, here is kind of the outcomes of the most recent studies and ways that we can do that. And so what I'll end the show the way I always do, but on a slightly different note to say is that if you like that on the politics side of things, that's what the Politics Guys is all about. You're making it possible for Ken and myself and Mike and May and Jay and others to be able to, it's not always easy. That's the case. So when I say that supporters are what make the Politics Guys happen, it's not just some pitch that I'm making at the end of the show. It is a pitch, but it's not just a pitch, right? There aren't that many people who can do what we can do or in professional positions that are able to do what we do. And your support is part of what makes the podcast go, because although we have the ability to do it, we don't get the funding. We don't get the kind of stuff that makes that happen. And it's expensive to do what we do. And so we want to give you kind of good stuff. So I would really support you, to remind you to say, if you like this kind of thing, seek out podcasts and information like the Politics Guys to try to understand those different areas and support. And that's tough to do. I get it. But it's supporters that make this and any other kind of show that's trying to do these kinds of things possible. And for the Politics Guys, at least, we're trying to give you other stuff. During the show, I talked about the Discord group. There's all different kinds of benefits to being a supporter of the Politics Guys. And so I'll just end the show, as always, by saying, look, head to patreon.com/politicsguys and take a look at becoming a supporter of the show and help us to do the kinds of things that we do and to try to get it right in the kind of adjacent areas. And so, I would love to see that biologist Politics Guys version, if you will. Would it be the biologist guys, I guess. But for now, take a look at patreon.com/politicsguys. There's other ways to support the show. As I've already mentioned, there's Venmo where we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. Head to the show notes to see all of those things. But again, you can go to politicsguys.com/support for that. We also have a midweek show that's part of what you get. And Ken and I have been doing the Constitution, and we'd love to for you to be a part of that. But don't forget, if you want to be able to get that, but you're not in a financial position to support the show, if you just shoot an email to mail@politicsguys.com, we can get you set up for that. Now, whether you're a supporter or not, don't forget that another big way that you can support us is by subscribing, rating, reviewing, and if you've already done those things, sharing this episode on your social media channels. Don't forget that if you got a question, comment, correction, gripe, manifesto, or anything else, you can always reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and X, and you'll find all of those in the show notes. A special thanks to the individuals who really make it possible for Ken and I to do that, and that's the executive producers of the Politics Guys. And I want to remind everybody, you can become an executive producer of the Politics Guy and join this outstanding group that I have loved to get to know a little bit better in a variety of our circumstances. And they are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode next week, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,